Okay. So we're going to go ahead and spend the rest of the time. We'll probably get through identity. We might not get to architecture today, but that's okay. We have plenty of time to still be able to take our quiz next Friday. Okay, so we're going to be looking at identity. And the first artist that we have is Jaune Quicksee Smith. We're going to be looking at the artwork named Trade, which is 233 in your note takers. Feel free to be taking some notes in pencil as we go over the artwork to kind of save yourself some time. Okay, so Jaune Quicksee is a member of the Flathead Nation. So she is Native American, and her work is typically based on social issues that she sees were caused by the European occupation of her ancestral lands. So she often addresses things like poverty, unemployment, disease, as well as alcoholism. And I'd even say stereotypes in her work, right? So she addresses the social issues that have affected her people and people like her. So the function of this piece, it is based on, and I'm going to probably say it improperly, quincentenary. So basically the anniversary of the non-celebration of the Europeans' occupation of North America. So it's not a celebration of the European occupation of North America. And so 1492 to 1992. That's kind of the function. That's why she made this painting. So let's just describe it. Let's just describe it in the most basic ways that we can. So let's look at the top and then kind of move our eye down through to the bottom of it and see if we can describe it. I'll give you a moment just to kind of look it over because there's a lot going on. Okay, Jasmine, can you help me out with the top? What's going on in the top of this piece?
There seems to be a string of, like, I guess sport objects, like baseball caps.
Yep, that's what sticks out to me too. There's like this line that's hanging from the wall. And then there's a bunch of things hanging from it. And the things I recognize the most are the ball caps. They're pretty identifiable. Okay, good. Emily, can you help me with what you see underneath that hanging line? It is, there's a canoe. There's a canoe on a big, gigantic painting. And when we look at the painting, it's not just a simple painting, it's pretty complex. So when we look at this one, we can see that she's inspired by a bunch of different art movements. So remember that postmodernism is often influenced by the past, and then the artist kind of alters it and changes it to create meaning. So when we look at her artwork, and we focus on it, can you guys see how the large canoe painting is broken up into three? Can you guys see that? There's like a line here and a line here. So it looks like a altarpiece. So this is almost an altarpiece of the occupation of native lands to the Americas, right? But she also uses the mark making. Notice how paint is smeared, it's dripping. You see the visible brush strokes. That is reminiscent of that emotional content that we see in abstract expressionism. So the art of Rothko, right? The art of Pollock, the art of de Kooning, which we have for our woman image in the 250. I'd even say kind of like that post abstract expressionist. So we don't have Rauschenberg, we looked at him, but this idea of adding three-dimensional and two-dimensional objects on the same piece as well, this kind of post-painterly abstraction of Rauschenberg. Another style that we kind of glimpsed over just because we ran out of time is the collage of the Dada. So remember how Dada was kind of based on non-art? There is this series by an artist where he would take trash and he'd collage it into a painting. And of course, he learned that from the Cubists. You know, the Cubists were collaging in newspapers and, wallpaper and things into their paintings. And so this idea of collaging into it. So behind all that abstract expressionist painting, there are images taken from newspapers and flyers and advertisements that all have depictions of Native Americans. So here we have a really nice close-up for you to think about what are the objects she's drawing upon. What kind of objects is she choosing to use? What kind of imagery is she choosing to use to create her meaning? Okay, so we see that sports memorabilia at the very top. We know constantly on the news, sports teams are changing their names, right? Because many groups find them offensive, right? So you have like the Cleveland Indian logo or the Washington Redskins. There's bumper stickers, there's lanyards for like from football games and baseball games, all hanging on this line. In the painting itself, if you look really carefully, you'll see that there are photographs, illustrations, things taken out of books and magazines. And a lot of it is based on stereotypes. So things like advertising, how Native Americans have been shown in like cigarette ads or alcohol ads or other things that kind of creates destruction. Also, sometimes it's taken from the local news. So like reservations have newspapers and they would take some of their like the issues that people were having in their cities. She would incorporate those into her paintings as well. And then there's things like photos of deer and buffalo and Native Americans in like traditional dress. Besides, these paraphernalia hanging from the top here, there's also like, when you go to like Wisconsin, you go to Wisconsin Dells. I think a lot of people have made the journey up to Wisconsin Dells. You go into a store and you see all these toy tomahawks and toy like feathered headdresses and things like that. So there's also the incorporation of photos of those as well as actual ones hanging on that line. So it's all kind of based on stereotypes and such. Right? So how does this all relate to her identity, right? Why is she including all of this into her image, right? She wanted to make sure that she portrayed the role of indigenous, between the indigenous and the European immigrants to the land, right? So she wants to make sure that we understand that people were given cheap goods instead of given real money, right? They were given kind of crappy European goods that they thought they were pretty or nice, and they would give them things that were worthless, and they would give up like ancestral lands as their payment, right? So it's kind of like this unequal giving of stuff. So all of this kind of kitschy, kind of crappy souvenir junk, right, at the top, right, is kind of reminiscent of the kinds of goods that Europeans were giving natives in place of really great lands that had great water source or buffalo to hunt or so on, right? She's playing on the stereotypes of how her people are viewed by the Western world or by those who invaded her world. And I think interesting enough that, when I never really I've known this piece pretty much my whole artistic life. And I never really thought about why she has just that canoe in the very center of the painting, right? I just thought, oh, it's just reminiscent of, the stereotype of natives traveling on canoes. But she also intentionally freezes it in the very center, right? It's all kind of stuck on the canvas. and it's unable to move. And she uses that to show the lack of progress that Native American society has had since the colonization of the Americas. So here's some other examples of her pieces. You can see that she kind of draws upon stereotypes or what, what uneducated people of Native Americans like know of them. So, oh, all Indians live in teepees, right? That's not true, right? But that's the assumption. Or this is the buffalo head nickel image. And so people might not know an Indian, but they might see one on their coinage, that sort of thing. Right? And then she also used appropriated imagery. So in this image that she made, she's calling on Da Vinci, right, with his Vitruvian Man, but also the idea of this nuclear image. And that's because a lot of natives were given land that was contaminated. So a lot of the lands that people live in today, during the Cold War, they would hide nuclear, like the trash from creating nuclear bombs in these lands. And so people were living in places that were harsh to begin with, and the US government made it even worse for them, right? They were poisoning their water, they were poisoning their land, and people were coming down with things like cancer and dying. This is some of her later pieces. I haven't actually looked to see what she's making lately. This is probably about 5 years old. She was doing a lot of like pictographs and almost like Lascaux imagery, where she was doing kind of representations of like cave painting. Okay, any questions on Jane Quicksee? Okay, the next artwork we have is by Pepon Osorio, and it's called No Crying Allowed in the Barbershop. I apologize for not pronouncing it in Spanish. My Spanish is atrocious. What he did is he created a installation, right? An installation. And for this installation, I would dare say it was site specific. I'd say it was site specific. He strategically went to a Puerto Rican community in Connecticut to install this image, right? Because the location is very important in to the idea of the artwork, right? But he also wanted to bring his art to the people that he's portraying, right? So Osorio was trained as a social worker. He is from New York City, which you may know has a high population of Puerto Ricans. He, like I said, intentionally placed this in a Puerto Rican community in Hartford, Connecticut. And he had local community people help to install the artwork. So they helped decorate and made kind of these elaborate kind of like altar pieces, which are often used in religious holidays in the Latino community. And he calls it Norican Baroque, right? So if you think about Baroque art, it's normally very elaborate, kind of like over the top. So he kind of plays on the name Puerto Rican with Baroque. So in his artwork, it's all about a story of when he, as a child, decided to be, his father takes him to a barber shop to get a haircut for the very first time. Like a real professional haircut. And so as a young boy, right, and some of the people, well, anyone in this class, has anyone ever had electric clippers at their heads? Has anyone gotten their hair cut by an electric clipper? Jeffrey? Anyone else in the class? Any of the girls? It happens with women too. Does it feel good, electric clippers? It's okay. Maybe my children just have sensitive heads. My children whine and complain because basically it vibrates and sometimes, you know, it cuts, but it also sometimes pulls the hair and it's kind of loud. And as a young child, it would be kind of scary to have this thing that kind of has these movable teeth come close to your head, right? You might think, oh, it's going to cut off my ear or it's going to hurt. And sometimes it does hurt, right? And so he, of course, young child starts to cry and his father says, there's no crying in the barbershop, right? Kind of like that male sort of stereotype. And so being Puerto Rican too, he felt this need to be manly, right? So his art installation, or at least this one, is about the concept of machismo, right? Machismo. So this overly masculine sort of idea. So let's look at our contextual or image on the right, as well as this one I've added on the left, which is a close-up. What's the machismo imagery? What's some of the imagery on the right that we see that we're like, wow, that's over the top masculine? Any stereotypes there? Jeffrey, can you give me one? I'll give you a hint. Look at the back wall here. What's painted on the wall? Flowers, yes. I don't necessarily think of flowers as being a masculine image, but the style of the flowers looks like a tattoo. You guys see that? So it's like a tattoo image with like a name above it. And what's underneath the flowers? Bullets, very good. And so we have, you know, images of violence, right? Now you can't see all of it in this image, but when we look at the chair a little bit closely, we see baseballs, which is very popular in masculine culture. It's kind of American pastime, but it's very popular in Puerto Rico. A lot of athletes are Puerto Rican, especially in baseball. He's got other images that aren't necessarily just masculine or machismo. He's got things that also represent his own experience, his own culture. So we see the Puerto Rican flag, and we see that it's highly decorated. Notice how much decoration is on that chair, right? And like I said, it kind of looks like these religious altars that are very common in like the Latino culture for like the Catholic in Catholicism, right? So like I said, this is based on his own experience of his first haircut. And it has things like the barber chair. Inside the building, it has a pool table, right? So for playing pool. It has sports paraphernalia all over the wall, right? Has a painting of things like tattoos with bullets. There's also photos, and you can see the photos here on the side wall, but there's other strange images of things like sperm and boy circumcision, as well as other sort of phallic images. And there's also a video playing with masculine stereotypes. So kind of like we saw with Bill Viola, or we looked at with Puck, there would be this visual component of a TV screen showing you imagery. And it was kind of like over the top masculine. I've never found a recording of it, so I'm still on the look for it to share with you guys, right? So you can see here's the pool table, right? And we've got all of these, we've got all of these kind of like Puerto Rican imagery with the flags, with the religious imagery, and kind of this kitschy objects. Kitsch is actually kind of a popular word today. We saw kitsch in Jaune Quicksee. We'll see it here. We'll see it in another image later. But kitsch is often art or objects, or sometimes even decoration that's considered in poor taste. It's kind of like sometimes considered to be like cheaply made. We sometimes think of it as like souvenirs, things that are sometimes kind of like over the top and gaudy, but sometimes they're also very sentimental, right? And so a lot of artists kind of use them to make pointed statements. So like Jaune Quicksee uses it to show like cheapness of things that were given to natives in place of land, but also, you know, the stuff that you'd buy at a ballpark, right? The cheap stuff that you probably overpaid for, right? And so he kind of, him and the community, I should make sure we understand that. Remember that the community is helping to create this installation. So he has locals from the groups helping to make these altar areas and add the decoration. So there's a lot going on. I mean, look, it looks like a crime scene has taken place. There's spotlights, right? There's debris. It looks like something tragic has happened inside this basic barber shop, right? So he took a barber shop and he altered it. There is a discussion on his work on Art 21 that you guys can feel free to look at on your own, but here's some other images of his works. So he does a lot of these installations. Sometimes they're in galleries and museums, and he tends to do them on platforms, sort of like how they use it for theater, where they use sets. So these would change so that you can rotate them from front to back for different scenes. So this one looks like it's a quinceañera, right? This girl in this big elaborate dress. Okay. So we're continuing with cultural identity. This is Shibboleth by Doris Salcedo. Right. So this image that we have is kind of a close-up of this. And this artwork was installed in the Tate Modern in London. So Tate Modern is kind of the quintessential modern art museum in Britain. And so Turbine Hall is an open space where you would buy your tickets, right? So it's this big atrium section of the museum where you would go to buy your tickets to enter into the facility. And over the last the last decade or so, what they basically did is they converted this old factory. That's why that's called Turbine Hall. It was an actual factory that they converted into a museum. They've added upon it as well. And this is what it looked like. So you guys see on the left, this is the Turbine Hall, right? And for the last decade, what they've basically done is they have allowed artists to create art installations or to put their art in this hall. So they have cemented the floor. I'll go back, right? They made it kind of like a clean slate. And then artists will install their artwork. So here we have like LED lights. Louise Bourgeois put this giant spider. We haven't seen her work, but she's a contemporary woman artist. Here, someone put like this shows time. So the sun actually rises inside Turbine Hall. Another artist made it into a giant sort of park for adults. So there's these adult size slides in the interior rather than for children. And then I honestly don't know what this is. It looks like it's got grass and soil on the floor, right? So for Salcedo, what she basically did, so for the form and the content here, we have this installation of a large crack, right? So the floor was opened. So basically what they did is they, I believe what I've read is they added some cement to the floor, right? And they intentionally opened it up so that there was a crack. And so the crack goes pretty much the whole length of the floor. It starts as a really thin sort of hairline crack. And then at its widest, it's about like a foot to 2 feet wide. And then it's like 2 feet deep. So there's a sense of depth to it as well. So inside this crack, she made casts. So just like we've seen bronze casts of in sculpture, right? What she did is she casted rock from Colombia. Salcedo is from Colombia, And so that is the imagery that's inside, and we'll see a close-up of that. So it has a cast of Colombian rock inside the crack, right? So the name of this piece is actually really important. It's called Shibboleth, and this is a word that has a lot of deep meaning. It actually comes from the Bible. So it's a word or a custom that a person not familiar with the language may mispronounce. So it's a very elaborate way of saying, I don't speak the language, so I'm going to say it improperly. But what happens is that it's a way for people to identify people who are foreigners or people who are different, right? Maybe they're from a different social class. Maybe they're from a different land, right? And it helps people identify people who do not belong. So it's not, it is language based, right? But mostly it's a way of expressing bias, right? It's a way of expressing bias. So in the Bible, basically somebody said something wrong, which is this word shibboleth, which I'm probably saying wrong too. So he said Shibboleth, and then basically it marked him as an other. And so he, as well as his people, were killed because of it. 42,000 were killed at one time, it says in Judges 12:6. So because of the name of this, right? Because of the name of this, what could the crack represent? What is the crack supposed to represent? Any educated guesses? Eva, can you help me out? What could the crack maybe mean?
Maybe that kind of bias can divide or separate people.
Very good. So it's a literal crack to show how people are separated, right? To show how people are separated. And so she uses the crack to represent the gap between relationships, the gap between people, right? The fear and the ignorance of those who are different, right? To show that misunderstanding. She uses it to represent the fear of immigrants. And she also uses it to show the effects of racism and colonialism, right? She's from Colombia, right? So in a land that was colonized, right? And she sees that, throughout history, what this did was it kept people separate, either intentionally or unintentionally. Sometimes we intentionally segregate people from each other. And that happened a lot in colonial lands, where people who were more white stayed by themselves and people who are native stayed by themselves. Some people who were native were pushed to other places because they were different. Or people who are immigrants who come to a different country are set aside because they are not like the people of the land. And so this is based on a video of a speech that she has, and it talks about the different migration that's kind of coming through. And it actually is a video where it shows you the flow of migration across the world over a time span. It doesn't work anymore, so I apologize. Should probably delete that, right? What I think is really interesting is not only is it a craft, but when you are in, it's actually, you can't see it anymore. It's covered up, which I'll show in a second, is that when you look at it and you look into the crack, so if you got down on your knees and you looked inside the crack, you would actually be able to see the media, right? So when we look at the media, why did she choose to incorporate what she did? So it has Colombian rock, right? So the Colombian Rock, or the cast of the Colombian Rock, is reminiscent of where she's from, right? It represents her experience because she too had to leave her land, right? She left Colombia and went to new places for her art career, right? If she wants to be an artist, she's going to have to go to major metropolitan places to show her work. She's going to have to teach, right? So she's going to have to go to cities that have teaching gigs for her, right? And then if you pay really close attention, I'll go back to this picture right here. Can you see in the rock, there's barbed wire and fencing incorporated? It's actually, this is more like fencing rather than barbed wire. And barbed wire and fencing are used to keep people out or to keep people in, right? Think about putting people in cages, right? Or separating like border walls and so on. So this installation was up for about 7 months. And after 7 months, they basically had to clean up to let the next artist in. So what they did is they filled it in with concrete. And you guys can see it in the photo here on the right side. You guys see how the crack is still seen, right? So the interesting thing is, even though this artwork was uninstalled, it still remains there forever, right? Can you guys see how it kind of feels like a scar? Right? It's kind of a scar. It's a constant reminder of the separation, the gap that people have from each other, and that lack of understanding for people who are different or other. Okay. That's it. That's all we have for today. We will continue with architecture on Monday, right? Since we didn't get that today. You guys can go ahead and leave early. Okay.